Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Caleb Teskey, and today I am joined by the president of the Institute of Cannabis Science, Jeff Rawson, joining us from Cambridge, Mass. Jeff, pleasure to have you
Caleb,
here, sir.
it's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me, man. My first podcast ever.
I love popping cherries.
Huh.
Before we get into any of the serious stuff, would you do a 5-minute life story for us?
Okay, I mean, it's let's see. The important things to know about Jeff. My name is Jeff. I'm a chemist, and I'm a chemist who cares about public health, and that's the reason I work in cannabis. But I didn't start out there. So I grew up in Florida, and I was one of those kids that's like interested in almost everything, like read a lot of books, played some sports, all kinds of stuff. And when I went to college, I wanted to go someplace far away to like some liberal arts college, I was very interested in esoteric knowledge. So I went to this place called Bard College, and eventually I majored in chemistry. And with enough time, I even graduated. And but I was always like kind of a square peg in a round hole. That's kind of how I felt most of my life. So I didn't really have like a super direct route to like grad school, but eventually I started University of Vermont and lived in Burlington for 5 years. And I finished a master's degree there in organic chemistry. And I went to Duke to do a PhD. And there I really like figured out research and figured out what I like and found my flow in chemistry. So I did stuff where I built these big, giant, elaborate molecules, right, which are actually really small, but on paper they look really big. Hundreds of atoms, really big organic molecules. And then the kind of research we did, we shoot a bunch of lasers at them and see what happens, and understand, really trying to probe like fundamental interactions between the photon and electrons. So all the stuff that you need to manipulate if you want to make new molecules for solar cells or for organic displays or LEDs. So those are kind of the applications that I looked at, but the work I did was really fundamental and narrow. And so after I got my PhD in 2014, I wanted to go someplace really far away and different. So I went to a research center in Germany for a few years and worked there. And that place was super deep and super narrow. And I realized that I was in the wrong area for myself. The stuff I did was really cool. Like we did experiments that looked at single molecules sometimes, right? Which is really, really neat. But the problem with it was that, if I tried to explain what I worked on to an average layperson and how it was relevant, it was very difficult. And a lot of the research projects there, they really, like, people's expertise was so deep, but so narrow that they really struggled to communicate even outside of their little discipline. And I didn't want to be like that. So I made a big change. I decided I was going to kind of leave behind that sort of esoteric science. And I came for a second postdoc to Harvard, where I worked with George Whitesides. And my whole goal was to learn to do research that would be really relevant. And so for a couple of years, I kind of couldn't figure out what I was doing. And then in the fall of 2019, a few people might remember, this was just before COVID. All right. In the fall of 2019, there was briefly this other epidemic that some people talked about of a vaping illness. And it turned out that it was, they called it E-Valley, is some abbreviation. But it's basically, it was like a lung illness that people got. And it turned out it was caused by electronic cigarettes for cannabis, which I was using pretty heavily. And it was an additive in a bunch of those. And in particular, it was an additive that usually only appeared in ones from the illicit market. So not usually from dispensaries or any state regulated market.
Vitamin E or something.
Yeah, it was vitamin E acetate. And, you know, it's never been like rigorously proven that that was the cause, but it's pretty well accepted. Yeah. So, you know, I think over the course of that fall 2019, maybe about 2,300 people were hospitalized. And I was one of them. I spent a week in the ICU and another week like in recovery. And after that, I thought, you know, electronic cigarettes, I mean, it's really interesting, actually, you know, like it's a totally different mode of consumption. In some ways, it's almost, you know, there's this way that you could try to think about it, you know, I mean, I like beer also, right? But, you know, like I don't like liquor that much. And, you know, they're both alcohol, but really in some ways, like they're kind of different drugs. Like they hit differently, you drink them differently, right? Like people get into different levels. I've known lots of people get into more trouble with liquor, right?
No comment.
Yeah, right. So you know, I think it's sometimes it's useful when you have something like e-cigs and compare it to smoking flower, right? In some ways it's different, right?
Sure.
Lots of people also talk about how the effects feel different. So so I decided that a really good niche, and then also e-cig's nice for a chemist, right? Because in cannabis flower, right, there's like lots and lots of chemicals in there, right? There's like hundreds, maybe thousands, a couple thousands of compounds, okay? And that's before you light it on fire. And when you light it on fire, that's a massive uncontrolled chemical reaction that makes a lot more compounds. So, you know, smoking is like pretty hard to study for a chemist, right? Like I got to know what the actual chemicals are. But an e-cig is simple, man. I mean, I formulated simple e-cigs that basically work, you know, with like 5 ingredients, right? It's basically like, it's essentially mostly THC and then some terpene compounds. And like, that's a simple formulation of an e-cig. So, you know, that's a handful of molecules that I can keep track of, right? It's tractable for a chemist. So, you know, so I started working on those.
Were you actually designing the physical vape or what was going in it?
Yeah, so what I was interested in was the exposure that it creates for the user. And, you know, and first of all, like, does the e-cig have the potential to do chemistry on the compounds that are in it, right? Right, because you would want to know that, for example, if you wanted to understand people getting sick from vitamin E acetate, right? Like the accepted mechanism for people to get EVALI is that the vitamin E acetate in the e-cig does a chemical reaction that makes a more reactive molecule that hurts the lungs.
So like you're saying with smoking flower, it's like a chemical reaction. Same thing with the vaporizer.
Yeah. Usually, so the idea of e-cigs is that they should be cleaner because there's no fire, right?
That was the selling point. Yeah.
Like, is there always, you know, is it always cleaner, right? Could the e-cig, even though it doesn't have so much like dirty like smoke, right, which I can see is kind of dirty, right? It makes stuff black, right? But like the e-cig doesn't make all that smoke, but maybe it still makes some harmful compounds, right? So that was kind of my curiosity. And I would, you know, after looking at them for a couple of years, I would say that under the normal circumstances of the e-cig use, it's probably in general like safer, right? Or maybe a little healthier, lower in harmful byproducts than smoking, right? That's kind of, but it's
Sure.
You know, but you know, an e-cig is what sent me to the hospital.
Let's
right?
Can we dive into that? I want to before we go too far into that, I want to rewind this for a second, but yeah, can you tell us? You sent me this article. We'll do that right now. It's called "Vaping Almost Killed Me" or something.
Yeah, I nearly died. Very
And
dramatic. Yeah.
where was that published at, Jeff?
Yeah, that's a column that I published as an op-ed in the Globe, in the Boston Globe.
No shit.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I just wrote about my experience and some of these concerns, right? That like I think that because the rollout of these cannabis e-cigs, it's kind of emblematic of a lot of the things that we see happening in the cannabis industry, where like kind of considered broadly, where new things are developed and they aren't really thoroughly tested before they get to consumers. And everything is so new that it's hard for people to even figure out how they should be testing it, right? Or what they should be looking for. Like they don't really know yet. And there are a lot of assumptions, right? Like lots of people were assuming that an e-cig should always be safer than smoking.
I was probably one of them.
Yeah, and that was reasonable, right? I mean, huffing smoke sounds bad, right? And this cleaner process sounds good, right? So, but it's one of those examples of something where you have to look a little more closely, and sometimes there can be edge cases where it's more dangerous. So, yeah, so that's what that to me, that was like, I mean, it was interesting to me because it like affected me personally, right? But it's also interesting scientifically. Like, the interesting science happens with stuff that's new and not well explored yet. So,
So it almost killed you, but you're still in there thinking about the science of it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not the only person to react this way, but it's actually pretty common.
Yeah, can you tell us the symptoms? Like, how did you realize that this might be a problem? What tipped you off that might be contributing?
Oh man. Well, yeah, I'm smiling because I think there's a very complex psychology because I think the thing that's so like this experience was profoundly embarrassing for me. It was so humbling. All right, like because like I really have to emphasize right now, like I did that to myself by being stupid. Like really, like I did really stupid things because like I was not the typical eValley patient. Like the typical eValley patients the typical eValley patients were less educated, right? I was a postdoc at Harvard in chemistry, so if anyone should have known better, it was me, right? I'm a very regular listener to NPR, right? National Public Radio, right? Like I pay attention to the news, right? I was aware that some people were getting sick from e-cigs, right? Like I knew that. And I just convinced myself that I was like smarter or I don't know what. Like
not gonna happen.
I really kind of buried my head in the sand. So it's hard for me to explain like what I thought or what I knew as it was happening. But basically, what started happening was I would get out of breath. I'd have shortness of breath. I can recall, I cycled. I live right in Cambridge, Mass, and so I get everywhere almost by cycling. That's like my main, so my groceries come to my home like one backpack full at a time. Like going up the hills, like I would have to stop at the top of the hill and like get off the bike and just take a breather for a minute. Yeah. But then I was so stupid, I'd still then take another hit of the e-cig.
Do you smoke cigarettes or anything, Jeff?
No, I don't. Yeah. I mean, I smoke some weed, right? Like, probably pretty common.
But prior to this, you were healthy, getting up the hills on your bike, all
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah, really, really fit guy, right? Like, fit enough anyway, right? Maybe a little bit of a tummy, right? I'm a dad. I got a dad bod.
We'll let it
So,
slide.
yeah, it's fine. So, like, yeah, and actually sometimes I'd have this kind of acidic taste in the back of my mouth too when I'd feel sick.
Mm.
So that was kind of a good clue for a chemist, because acidic taste, it's like sour, it's a really sour taste.
Yeah.
So so I had some warning signs, but at that time there hadn't really been much of a hypothesis floated about the cause. People didn't really know that much. So I think that maybe made it a little easier for me to hide my head in the sand. But what happened was one weekend I got really sick to my stomach. And so what I actually thought was that I thought I had food poisoning. Like, and I didn't associate it with the E6. Like, it didn't coincide directly with some breathlessness. So I got sick to my stomach and I couldn't eat food for a couple of days, and I could barely, I was just laid around. I tried to like ride it out over the weekend, just like lying around my place. And that Monday morning, I was still feeling really sick and I was lightheaded. And I took a lift to Mount Auburn Hospital, and I walked into the emergency department, and I checked in, and then I sat down and I tried to send some text messages to a couple of coworkers, like, back at the lab, let them know where I was. And I remember the black text just melted into the white background. Like, I couldn't read. I was so hypoxic.
Wow.
And even like the nurse who checked me in was looking at me funny, because I was like, I guess I really looked hypoxic. Like I was, but my blood oxygen was very low, basically, when they tested it. And then of course, like, this was common for E-Valley patients. So the first thing I did when I was in the hospital was I lied to the doctor about my use of e-cigs.
Did they ask you about that?
Yeah, they did. I
Were you
said, no,
using
I got like food poisoning. So they came up with this alternative, because I lied to them. They first, like, they were like, well, maybe you like aspirated some vomit and you have like some lung infection or something, or maybe, like, right. They should have known. I don't know. They should have guessed I was lying, but this is what people do, that's like, that was such a challenge of treating this
But
condition.
you're an upstanding PhD scientist. You wouldn't lie to a doctor, Jeff.
Yeah, but like, that's the if you're addicted to something and you're embarrassed about it, then that's what you do. You lie about it. So
Were you using the e-cig during the 2 days that you were trying to ride this out and sick at home?
that's a great question. To be honest, I can't. Probably a little. I probably tried it a few times to settle my stomach.
I was going to say, if you're having trouble eating, it seems like that might be something you would reach for. Like, maybe this will help.
Yeah, definitely,
Okay.
right? Like that. I probably I really can't recall precisely.
Okay.
Like I think mostly I just laid around doing like doing nothing. But
Just curious. Back to the
yeah,
hospital.
yeah. So so yeah, I started my stay in the hospital by like lying to the doctors, but it didn't take long before I had to come clean. And yeah, so they the treatment for this lung injury was a big hefty dose of steroids. And I'm really lucky, because it turns out that works really well. And so even for a pretty severe case like mine, where I really came pretty, came pretty close to just shutting down my pulmonary system. Still, there's almost no permanent damage. So, you know, I mean, I'm healthy and fit today, but it was really scary because at the time that I was being treated, they still actually weren't sure, you know, like they weren't, it was difficult for them to be confident of what my level of recovery would be.
Mm.
And that was really scary, you know.
How long were you in there?
Well, I spent a week in the ICU and then like a
Whoa,
week in recovery.
holy shit.
Yeah, yeah, you know, partly because again, right, since I lied at the beginning, it took them longer to cure me.
Did I
You
read
know.
something in this story about maybe like misdiagnosis and they gave you antibiotics or something instead of steroids?
Yeah, yeah, they started out with that. Yeah, because of what I told them. Yeah. Yeah. And this is a really important thing, you know, doctors doctors do amazing work because they really have to, you know, they have limited information to work from and it's often really imperfect.
Yeah. And a lot of
So
people lie or
yeah,
leave
yeah. I
stuff
mean,
out. Yeah.
I don't. I think that I don't think that lying is the biggest problem. But they always, you know, anything that you report yourself, right, is difficult for you to describe. Right, it's
Okay.
difficult for you to describe in a way that the doctor can understand what you're talking about.
Mm,
You know, it's
fair.
just, you know, it's hard, and also like a human body is a very complicated system. Right, it's not fully understood.
Mm, very true.
So yeah, so yeah,
So
yeah. So
they
I feel
tried the
really lucky.
antibiotics, didn't work, and then they got you on some steroids.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a very effective treatment for that sort of lung injury. So, um, yeah, so it worked really fast.
That must have been nice. 'Cause I'm sure if they're feeding you antibiotics and you're not getting better, it's like, hey, what the
Yeah,
fuck?
yeah, that was yeah, right. It was scary, and they were yeah. I mean, I have nothing but good things to say about the folks at Mount Auburn Hospital. Like they
Shout
yeah,
out.
I mean they were like they honestly though. I mean they, you know, like the doctors that I saw there approached me very critically. Like there was not it, they didn't let me sit there being treated with antibiotics very long before they started asking me harder questions.
So they
You
could
know,
see it wasn't working, and they were like,
yeah, yeah. They're like, so what else is going on, guy? Like, yeah,
and so you had to come clean. And that, I mean, sounded like it was something you really hadn't talked about a lot in your life, perhaps.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think that was hard for me. You know, I had a pretty particular idea of what I was supposed to present to the world, right? Or what kind of a person I'm supposed to be if I'm a scientist. Uh, and a scientist isn't supposed to be the kind of person that's so, you know, that keeps on sucking on this stupid thing while it's killing them. You know, like you're supposed to know better, right? Right. And like, I mean, I completely ignored evidence that I was actually receiving. You know, I wasn't an uninformed person. So, you know, that was what was the hardest was to admit that I had made such silly mistakes.
Mm.
Like it was yeah, profoundly humbling.
Well, don't worry, Jeff. I went to engineering school, and I've seen scientists do all kinds of dumb shit. I saw a kid fall asleep under a
Yeah,
van.
yeah.
I saw a kid fall asleep drunk under a van in December one time. So
Jesus. Okay, well,
he's got a great job now, and he's doing wonderful. So,
yeah, yeah, sure. That's the thing, right? I mean, that's what we, yeah,
mm.
yeah,
so
yeah.
so did they have you hooked up? Did they have to put you on oxygen or any shit like that?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I had the oxygen tubes blowing. They actually had them blowing really hard. They had they had like the nose thing, and that was the critical juncture actually that caused my doctors to confront me about what might be really going on. It was because they were treating me with antibiotics and I was getting worse, and so they thought it was probably about time to intubate me.
Oof.
And as you know, intubation is that's like a really critical step. Patients who are intubated in the hospital usually end up spending a lot more time in the hospital than patients who aren't. And you're, because that's the sign, intubation, that means your body can't really breathe for itself at all. And so they're sticking a tube all the way down in,
Yeah,
right?
it does not look like fun.
Yeah, it's pain. Yeah, it's not comfortable. You can't, and at that point, then you can't talk, right? Because there's a tube going down your throat. So, basically all of like their statistical metrics of like how many patients recover, right? Everything looks much worse once you get past intubation. So, yeah, it's kind of like, it's like if you divide all your hospital into two groups, like intubated patients and those who aren't, right? You would really much rather be in the ones who aren't, because you're much more likely to walk out of that hospital. So,
And just the thought of having that stuff down my throat, I think I'd rather just be honest with the doctor at that point.
yeah.
It's a good scare tactic.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I think maybe that the doctor might have been thinking that too. A little scared straight, right? So,
We're gonna have to chop your balls off. Like, tell us what happened. Yeah.
yeah.
So boy, a week in ICU, a week in recovery, and how'd you feel out? Were you good to go when you got out, or I mean, were you still like slow, or how'd the
Oh,
recovery go?
it took a couple months to recover. And especially immediately out of the hospital, those first couple of days were also like really interesting, because I even a short flight of stairs could tire me out. Um, and and that was a huge difference for me from like normal life, because I am like I'm a pretty hyperactive person. Right. And like I said, like fit and cycled everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So I've always kind of had an overabundance of energy, right? It's like my body has this big engine that's really cranking in there. But immediately after getting out of the hospital, it was a totally different situation. It was like that big engine had been replaced with this tiny little battery. And yeah, one of the most profound things I noticed was if I went outside, I'd bundle up so much and I'd still feel cold.
Hmm.
And I would look at the world differently. Like if I walked into the pharmacy, right? Like I remember I went to CVS to buy a couple of things, right? And usually what I do when I'm in CVS and I'm trying to find what I want is I walk around the store, right? Until I find what I want, right? It's kind of what you do. You go look for stuff, right? Well, I didn't do that because I didn't have the energy. So instead I stand there right by the entrance and I look around for a long time and figure out exactly what I want, and then get there the most efficiently I can, right? Like conserving every shred of energy. And I realized that that's like, I'm sure that it's a little different, but in some ways, that's kind of what it feels like to be old. I think that that's kind of a part of like aging, right? As you get older, your battery shrinks and you have less energy for stuff, right? So
Yeah.
I feel like it was a profound perspective,
Yeah, certainly for also like tying this into your work down the road. I mean, that you didn't tell me about this on the phone. You snuck one in on me here, buddy.
Oh
Uh,
man, I didn't mean to do that. It's just,
no, I love it. I
I
love
just
it.
I just I got so many things on my mind.
So so that was 2019. How old are you now, Jeff?
I'm 44.
Okay. So you were about 40 then? Boy,
Yeah,
in good
yeah,
shape. And that's, I remember when these cases started to hit the news. And I honestly, at first glance, my knee-jerk reaction was like, oh, this is some more like big tobacco propaganda or some, like
yeah.
pharmaceutical companies trying to control the vape market or something like that. I just assumed, I was like, no way, like, and here we are, like talking about an actual case. And what'd you say? There was like 2,000 or 2,500 or something?
Something like that. I think maybe 2,500 is probably pretty close to the total.
Yeah. And, you know, I just assumed that those people like, oh, you get a little cough or something, or it goes away or whatever. But
Yeah.
it sounds like it could range from like uh not that serious to almost dying.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that I was fortunate partly because by the time I was hospitalized, it was a better recognized condition, and people had started figuring out the correct treatment. But there were some earlier victims who suffered much worse. I mean, some people died. Um, some people have struggled to fully recover. Some people had lung transplants.
Whoa,
Yeah.
fuck.
So yeah, so I'm a very lucky person.
Let me ask you this. Where did you get the cart from? Was it from a legal store, or did you get it on the
No,
black market? Yeah.
no, I got it from a website. That was like the thing, yeah. It was the classic thing, I got it from like one of those unlicensed delivery services. Um and in retrospect, I mean, I know I know a lot of people in the testing lab space, and I've discussed it with them. They've all told me that they only ever found vitamin E acetate in illicitly sourced cartridges in Massachusetts. All right. Nobody ever found vitamin E acetate in any of the carts from the regulated market. So, so it also actually, I mean, that experience also tells you something, right? That like, which I took as very important, which is that the legalization and the adult use market is a public health good. All right. It's not without drawbacks, but it's a public health good. That
I would say
marketplace.
I would put a caveat there that says if it's run in an honest and, you know, like the way it should be, you know, quote
Yeah,
unquote.
yeah, yeah. That's not that it always has to be, or any manifestation. It's not that any manifestation of an adult use market would automatically be good, but it turns out that this is better than nothing, right? And which is a point that I'm really glad I get to make, because the work I'm doing now, a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm criticizing aspects of the adult use, or these regulated state markets. I'm criticizing parts of them that aren't working well enough yet. But it's a very important point that this is still better than the alternative. And
From a public health standpoint, I would agree with you. From some
yeah, yeah,
from some of the other standpoints, boy, those taxes are just outrageous. But yeah, I do agree with you
yeah,
on that
yeah.
for sure.
I'm thinking in a very general big picture
No,
here,
sure,
right?
sure.
Where you ignore all you're kind of ignoring the flaws, or you're just lumping them all together and not really thinking about each one individually. So yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I'm very open to the complaints and criticisms that people do have for regulated markets, and I'm interested in making it better. But I've seen a couple of examples where still it seems like the you know the most harmful products tend not to show up as readily in regulated markets.
I would
And
say that's a fair point.
yeah, and
Mhm.
the imperfect scrutiny that we get in regulated markets is still better than the almost zero scrutiny that there is for the production of products in the legacy market. I mean, there's no telling what anyone does, right? You really have to know someone.
Sure.
You really have to know someone and know what they're doing in the legacy market. That's the challenge.
Hmm. Good thing I got a couple of those guys.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't doubt it.
Um, Boy, I want to get into I want to geek out here a little. But one thing I did want to mention was this note in your CV here about sort of like something about, you mentioned it earlier about kind of talking about science in a way that people can understand. Because for sure I've read and I breezed through one of your papers earlier, and for anybody that doesn't know chemistry, that's just a bunch of gobbledygook. It means nothing. I know a few of the words, but I'd like to maybe tie that in to this next part of the discussion, and some Bill Nye kind of break it down for us like that. Is that something? Because I also found myself, I have a physics degree, and I didn't have to do that a lot at school because I was the dumbest kid at school. But like when I come back and like I'm smarter than some of my friends at science, and they don't understand some of the shit I'm saying, and trying to figure out how to word everything and explain like concepts in a way that people can understand is definitely something that I've found to be super challenging.
Yeah, I think we all do. I think actually, boy, yeah, I spent so much time thinking about this and talking about it that it's hard to know where to start or how long to go. But you know, communication is probably the hardest part of science, actually, and I think it's also the biggest flaw with how science is done now. I think that science is often made to look more difficult than it is. And I'll use that paper in front of you as an example, right? So there are a whole bunch of words in that paper that were chosen because they have many syllables and they look fancy and it feels good to write them if you're writing about science, right? Right? I don't
Yep.
in that paper, I am talking about making a really big molecule and then putting a single electron in there and watching how the negative charge from that electron spreads out over the molecule.
This was the
So
laser experiment you were talking about where you're blasting lasers
and then I measure it with laser spectroscopy. Yeah.
oh,
I
sick.
measure it with laser spectroscopy and with magnetic spectroscopy. And right, but the terms I don't call it a big molecule, right? I talk about its spatial extent, right? And like, I don't say the negative charge spreads out. I say it delocalizes, right? So it's all these words that are actually chosen um, to feel very nice and specific for the five of us who really know what we're talking about. But it's also like, and I mean, I'm not the first person to say this. I mean, a lot of the lingo in science is designed to deliberately exclude people
You
or
think so?
make it harder. I don't think people admit it or say that out loud very much, but I think that that's part of the point.
I've never heard
You know,
anybody suggest that, and fascinating, fascinating idea there, Jeff.
I think that there's, I mean, my view of science from kind of the inside um, is that there's a lot of really great, curious people in science, right? Who are very passionate and they love to share. They love to share their knowledge and they love to support people, lift up others, right? But there's also a lot of insecure people, and it's it's harder it's harder to develop a totally unique understanding of something that's new um and and deeper than what other people have achieved. It's a lot easier to just come up with some fancy words and then hope maybe you'll snow a few people, right? Um unfortunately, I've not always, I have not always encountered like science to be so inclusive. In fact, I've sometimes seen this pretty exclusive and elitist. So uh
I'd
yeah,
agree with that. Although, yeah, I'd agree.
I
Although
think
I
even
wouldn't
when
have
it's
considered it was for the reason you suggested there, which I'm going to factor into the math next time I'm thinking about that. But definitely, I remember there's this whole STEM push to get more inclusion, more people of color, more women involved in science and math and
Mhm.
stuff like that.
Yeah, I've also seen that in in graduate education, and sort of the advanced education of scientists. So once people are getting their PhD, you know, they've got their college degree, right? At that point, the other thing that starts to happen in science is you have one advisor who has really a lot of influence on your fate. You know, they are the one person who's supposed to mentor you and direct you. You know, who your advisor is determines what kind of science you're doing, what your project is. And this is the person who is going to be most involved in evaluating the quality of your work, and then eventually promoting you and sending you off with their letter of recommendation, which is the number one, probably the number one distinguishing factor between you and other people, is like kind of how good your recommendations are, how many papers you published. So that means that there's a critical step of scientific advancement, and that dependence, by the way, only becomes more acute once you're a postdoc. So after you get the PhD, you often, if you want to be like a professor, you know, what we think of as like the most pure scientist, then you go for this postdoc, right? Then you're even more acutely dependent upon a relationship with a single person. And, you know, in human relationships, I mean, gosh, a big factor is bias, right? So I have seen countless examples of, you know, it's not intentional, but the advisor naturally gravitates towards those students who it's easiest for the advisor to get along with, right? And keep in mind, this is, you know, the advisor is also someone who is exceptionally trained in science, but has never been trained in any way, has never received even the most rudimentary instruction in managing people.
That's another
Right?
interesting point.
Yeah. So,
And you know, Jeff, let me cut you off for a second. A lot of
yeah.
research scientists are brilliant people, and a lot of professors are super smart, but a lot of them are terrible with the communication. Like, they might be super good at research, but when they go to try to teach a class, it's can be ugly sometimes. And a lot of guys, I don't know if it's something just with scientists, but they're so focused on their work and involved in the math and stuff. Like, sometimes the communication just gets lost, or you know, it's hard to socialize with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it's also just a fundamental human limitation. I mean, you can't be great at everything, right?
Sure.
And you know, but you're right, you know, but I do believe that there can be I believe there can be an improvement in focus. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know, you know, like Bill Nye, right? That guy has been working in communicating science very professionally for decades, right? So, you know, I guess he's probably one of the all-time best, right?
Carl Sagan.
Yeah. If not by, you know, if not by inborn talent, then certainly from experience.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
And I watched Bill Nye when I was a kid, and that's what got me interested in science, you know?
Yeah. When I was growing up, my favorite little things were Mr. Wizard. I loved Mr. Wizard.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you know, so yeah, I mean, I'm striving to be accessible and to communicate to people. I recognize that it's the number one job, right? Ultimately, it's the number one job is actually communicating why your science is important, why people should care, what they can learn from it, what it can do, you know, but it's not easy.
Yeah, and I found myself, like, we had to write a bunch of papers to get through WPI. There's 3 projects you got to do. And I found myself just not being very good at the science. And I was like, yo, guys, if you could knock that out, I'll write the paper, because I'm really good at writing papers. And a couple of other kids that were just clueless. They're talking about their feelings and shit in a research paper. It's like, no, we don't put that in there, buddy. We talk about what we did and what happened. And that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, and Yeah, and so ideally, I mean, science is done. That's a good reason why science is done by teams of people, right? Because it does require so much expertise, and the scientific problems that we often try to take on. Also, you know you you just can't be an expert in everything. You just can't.
Mhm. And it seems like you've done a good amount of teaching here. I got your teaching list. It looks like you've done some well, a little bit of everything in here. Undergrad, grad, master's theses, high school students,
Yeah.
little bit of everything, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And especially once I was at Harvard, I really I spent a lot of time doing like outreach, um and working with kids from schools, but also mentoring students in the lab. So
Oh, that must have been fun.
yeah, yeah, it's super fun. It's that's some of the most rewarding work, because that's where I could really work one-on-one with a student, teach them stuff from a real research project, really get them involved, and show them what doing science is. And I developed great relationships with students that way. And they teach me things like and then in the end, like they're really grateful afterwards. I mean, they're beautiful relationships that you develop this way.
Yeah, that
So
sounds awesome, man. And so this is cool because, most of my audience is, well, I got a range too. I got another PhD guy who watches my shows, but we also got just a lot of non-scientists, but curious folks. And so I was really hoping we could nerd out in a way that people could understand about these vape carts and the
yeah.
testing that you do on the vape carts, man, because that was really fascinating when we spoke on the phone.
Yeah, yeah. I'll tell you a little more about that. So as I said, right, I started trying to do research on cannabis e-cigs, right? And I was a postdoc at Harvard. Well, that's when I started encountering the challenges of doing research on cannabis, right? So um uh the rules are such that basically I you know no federal grant money may be used to study Schedule 1 drugs. Okay, so the only mechanism for doing that is getting a license from the DEA, right? Which, also keep in mind, that's not a research organization, that's an enforcement organization.
Right.
So their priority is not making research easy, right? um so you got to get that license, and then you've got to acquire. You can't do any research on street drugs, right? You've got to acquire your cannabis or cannabinoids. You got to acquire them from the NIDA drug program. So that NIDA drug supply program is very limited.
That's the
Um,
Institute of Drug Abuse or something. National
yeah,
Institute.
National Institute of Drug Abuse. Yes,
Cool.
it's one of the institutes in the NIH. Yeah.
Or
So that's the main research organization in the United States that gives grants to researchers to study any kind of drugs. And yeah, so basically what this meant was my mentor, George Whitesides, told me right up front. He said, "Okay, so look, we're not getting the DEA license." He said, "That takes too long and it's too much paperwork, and we're never going to have time. So you can't do that. So you've got to figure out how you do this without that." So I said, "Well, for a while, for at that time, Delta 8 THC was technically legal. The 2018 Farm Bill had made hemp-derived cannabinoids, even if they're even if they're derived by a chemical reaction from other hemp compounds, right? As long as they don't contain Delta 9 THC above a certain very low level,
0.3% or something.
yeah, they're hemp instead of cannabis, right?
Yeah.
Or hemp instead of marijuana. Sorry. So essentially what the 2018 Farm Bill did was it took the cannabis plant and it redefined it as two plants, right? And it distinguished hemp and marijuana. And marijuana is defined by containing delta-9 THC. So now there have been a lot of funny outcomes of this. And eventually the DEA issued a clarification that they still consider delta-8 to be illegal. But for about a year, it was existing in a gray area where I could actually bring it into my lab and do analysis on it. So that allowed me, and delta-8 THC is chemically so similar to delta-9 THC. They're both like these very sticky, viscous, clear substances. They're a lot like, I don't know, like some kind of glue, right? That's almost cured. And, you know, so I could do some vaping experiments with it, right? But I realized that if I wanted to be able to do a project that could actually go forward, where I could use my lab resources, then I needed to focus on the hardware, which is not a controlled substance. And that brought me to an interesting problem of e-cigs and how they're currently regulated, right? Because, right, I mean, you know, which is another one of these like challenges of legalization and forming regulatory bodies to try to police cannabis products, right? Is that there are a lot of different kinds of cannabis products. And the e-cig is peculiar because there's a piece of hardware. So that's a big difference. And but you know, the people who work in cannabis tend not to come from an engineering or like physical background, right? Sure. So what I found is that people in the cannabis space really didn't know how to look at that thing. So what they were doing, you know, one of the concerns with e-cigs was that they might contain heavy metals, right? And that those which are harmful to humans in even very small quantities, right? And that, you know, that the heavy metals will be bad, and so you need to watch out for it. So the tests that people designed to test for the heavy metals aren't very, you know, are kind of wrongly chosen. What they do in Massachusetts anyway is they put the cannabis oil in the cartridge, and then they take it back out and they test the cannabis oil. And if it contains heavy metals like lead, then they say that it fails. And then at that point, the manufacturer has to destroy all the cartridges that they filled with that oil, right?
How long do they leave the oil in there before they take it back out?
It is not specified. That's a really great question, because that's the first question, right? Obviously, right, one thing that should matter is how long the oil is in there. All right. Yeah. So, well, it turned out, so that vape crisis that we talked about earlier was actually very relevant, right? Because during that time, there was temporarily a ban on selling cannabis e-cigs. A lot of people might not, some people will remember this now that I prompt them, right? But for a few months, you couldn't buy cannabis e-cigs at all at dispensaries in Massachusetts. Right? They weren't supposed to sell them. And they also banned nicotine vapes for a while because people really didn't know what was causing the problem, or not enough, or it wasn't well enough recognized.
Vermont put a 92% tax on like jewel pods. There was.
Yeah. So what that meant was there was a whole bunch of cannabis e-cigs sitting around for a long time. And then people had to figure out what to do with them. And they said, okay, well, one thing we should do, let's retest them. And what they found was a bunch of ones that previously had cleared the screening. Now, after sitting around for months, they didn't pass anymore.
So they just decided on a whim. They're like, we're going to retest them just for the hell of it, just to be sure. And
yeah, to try to be safe, because they didn't know what to do.
And this was after a few months, you said?
Yeah, after months. Yeah, and so what that means, right? I was able to, that result actually was part of what told me what I would find, right? So I was able from that to surmise, okay, if more lead gets into the oil after it sits in the cartridge for a while, then did the lead come from the oil or did the lead come from the cartridge?
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, it must have come from the cartridge, right? And that makes sense, right? Actually, because the way they prepare that oil for the cartridge is usually they distill the THC.
Right. So all the
Right?
heavy metals should fall out, right?
Yeah. When you distill an organic compound like that, it's very unlikely that you will carry over any heavy metals, right? So
What kind of stuff could you carry over in the distillation process?
well, other organic compounds. So, some hazardous substances won't be removed by distillation. Like pesticide residues and mycotoxins might be carried over. And in fact, there's some concern that in some concentrates that are made from distillate, right, that pesticides might actually be concentrated by the process.
It is a concentrate after all. Yeah, that's
Yeah. The pesticides might be another one of the things that's enriched by the process. So that's kind of that's another one of those like concerns that's out there with these products that we don't really know how well founded or how extensive. We don't know if it's a real problem or not, but it's something we worry about sometimes. So I was able to figure out then, all right, well, the lead must come from the metal, right? And that makes sense actually. So I didn't start out doing this research project quite so smart, but by the end I kind of figured out a really good approach. I learned, I just started asking, all right, so where do these cartridges come from?
China.
Right. And so what I learned, right, there's one kind of trademark that's pretty well known among kind of like people who pay attention to vaping and cartridges, right? It's C-cell, right? And it's C-cell has maybe about 70% of the total vape cart market, like the empty cartridges, right? And they all come from the same factory in China. And I've looked enough on YouTube. You can even find some little videos and pictures and like see kind of how they're made. All right. But basically the cartridges, right, there are a few pieces of metal all stuck together and then some glass and a couple of like silicone O-rings. That's basically what the cartridge is made out of.
Yeah. A little heating element or something.
Yeah. And a little heating coil on the inside. And that C-cell cute little name comes from the fact that it's a ceramic wrapped heating coil. The heating coil is wrapped in a porous ceramic. And so that means that the oil isn't vaporizing directly off the red hot coil necessarily. So it gives kind of a cleaner vape.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Right?
It's like taking a dab where you heat up the glass and then it just burns off the glass kind of instead. Okay. I guess.
Yeah. So, well, what I learned how, so that assembly process of the cartridge, it doesn't involve any solder or any glue or anything. All right.
Really?
It's really just, it's all held together by pressure.
They just snap together.
Yeah. It's basically just snapped together from little component pieces. All right. And so I did a little more digging and learned, it turns out all those component pieces are made anytime any little elaborate piece of metal like that is almost always made by a process of subtractive manufacturing, which means some kind of like taking a bigger block or rod, right? These are cylindrical cartridges. So in this case, it comes from a rod. They take a rod of metal and they cut away all the parts they don't want. All right. And it turns out that process of cutting away all the stuff you don't want is like 100 times easier if the metal you start with contains like 1 or 2% lead.
Oh, because it's a little bit malleable or something, or like softer to cut through.
Yeah. I have some really cool pictures and videos that I could show you later if you want that like really go into this. But yeah, basically there's this. So that manufacturing process, right? you can imagine it's not done by someone with a hammer and a chisel, right? It's a high speed automated manufacturing process done by a big, fancy, expensive machine.
Yeah.
And what it does is the machine has a bunch of different tool arms, and it's programmed to do some, set of operations each time, spin the thing around and grind off stuff to taper it, et cetera, right? And so the amount of energy that machine uses depends on how easily the material comes off of the workpiece. And the inclusion of the lead makes this little microstructure in the alloy where the lead segregates from the rest of the metal, and it's under pressure. And then as the tool on the machine hits that little pocket of lead, it bursts and relieves the pressure. And so the chips of waste material go flying off. And because those chips of waste material go flying off, they don't slow down the tool as much. They don't grind down the drill bit or the lathe blade, right? And the machine can run faster, and it won't jam as often.
So they're just trying to save money.
Yeah. So it's just cheaper. And it turns out that for parts made on these machines like this, most of the material cost is not, or most of the cost of the total part doesn't come from the materials at all. So like this manufacturing process, 90% of the metal becomes waste. You don't care, because the most expensive thing is the machine time.
I was going to say, yeah, just keeping those things spinning probably.
Yeah.
You got 10 cents worth of metal in a fucking $1 million machine.
Yeah, exactly. And so so it turned what I learned is every little, especially like all the plumbing fittings and gas fittings, as you look around your house or look at any of your plumbing, what you see is all these brass fittings, right? This is how they're all made. And so back in the 80s and 90s, people started realizing that and getting concerned about it, and getting concerned about this lead getting into drinking water. And so they changed the law. And so now there's alternatives to these leaded metals for this process, but it's more expensive.
Well, and you said the excess just goes to waste. Can they like melt it down?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
And the waste can be recycled.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's a process. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, but and it's so funny, right? That so like, I mean, I don't think that like maybe it won't be so surprising to a lot of people, but it's still like a little surprising to me that like the cost of this part has nothing to do really with the cost of the material it's made out of. It's the cost is the time that went into it.
Mm.
That's so, it was very interesting to me.
Yeah, boy, like it does seem like there's really just a few companies controlling the entire manufacturing process for the actual physical cartridges, and they're all in China. And if that's like a standard operating procedure, like, we're throw some lead in there because it's cheaper and faster, like, boy.
Yeah. And so the good news that I learned is that those that big that big well-known trademark C-Cell, right? They have about 70% of the cartridge market, and they don't use leaded brass. All right, so it's really the cut rate cartridges that are knockoffs that are made out of the leaded brass usually.
Because I was wondering about this. We talked about it on the phone, and I was like, man, I can't imagine that these guys make much of a distinction between whether carts go into the legal market or the illegal market. If there's only a handful of companies, I had just assumed like, well, they probably just sell carts to everybody and make them all the same. So that's another interesting point there.
Yeah. So what it actually is, like C-Cell actually has enough of name recognition and market dominance that they have an active interest. They have patents which they defend, and they file trade actions against knockoffs made by competitors. So they try to defend they have a position of market superiority that they work to defend. And these knockoffs, don't usually have any brand name on them, and they try to make them look as much as possible like C-cell. So what tends to happen in this marketplace, the process of buying these cartridges with this well-recognized trademark from C-cell, right? You have to they have a handful of distributors in the US, and they ask for a business license, like you need to make an account with them and then order in pretty good bulk in order to get their cartridges, right?
Yeah.
Or you can go to cheapcarts.com and get cartridges that look a lot like C-cell cartridges. They cost a quarter as much, and you don't need any of that stuff.
Got you.
So what tends to happen is people with licensed weed businesses, they jump through the hoops to get the C-cell cartridges, or another brand that's another brand that is trading off of brand recognition, right? But there's this undercurrent market of brands that are just, they're not brands, right? They're trying to just look like someone else's product.
Right?
Yeah,
I've seen a lot of the knockoff TKO cards.
Yeah. It's like knockoff. It's like other kinds of knockoff markets. It's like knockoffs of knockoffs in like fashion or luxury goods, right?
Sure.
It's really a similar thing, that there's usually, for anything where the brand name itself has some significance, there's always knockoffs.
Sure.
And it turns out that for this case, the knockoffs are the ones that contain the lead usually. Yeah. So once I understood that the lead we're looking for, right, it's not coming from the oil, right? And it's not some tiny amount hidden somewhere deep in the cartridge, right? It's 1 or 2 or 3% of the total metal of the cartridge in the big pieces, the biggest pieces of it, right? So then that means that the way we're testing for it is wrong, right? What we could do is just rapidly screen the metal itself. And there are analytical tools, this whole thing of like, put the oil in the cartridge,
yeah,
and
it sounds
take
like
it out and test it, right? This is sort of like, imagine that you wanted to make sure your fork doesn't contain lead, right? But then you don't think, oh, I should test the fork for lead, right? Instead, you stick it in a plate of mashed potatoes and you leave it there for a week, and then you test the mashed potatoes for lead. It doesn't make sense, actually.
And I bet it's a sticky fucking mess too, trying to.
Yeah, and it sucks. It's their least favorite test. I've talked to people at the testing labs, they got to break these things open and scrape out. This stuff is gummy. It's a mess.
Yeah.
So, so I figured out this is a very easy way to screen.
Sorry, I got some barking dogs over there.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I love dogs.
Carry on.
Yeah. So this is a very easy way to screen for that lead, actually. And it's what it's actually what they use in these factories, right? Because in factories all the time, anytime that they're doing metals manufacturing, right? They need to test raw metals that come in to make sure that they're what they expected, right? And and sometimes also, in a factory where you're making stuff out of metal, you got some room that's just full of all these metal bars, right? Or rods or whatever your raw material is, right? And you got to sort it out sometimes, make sure everything's been filed correctly, right? So there's a pretty simple point and shoot X-ray spectrometer that can readily detect what elements are present.
It's just like a handheld.
Yeah. There's handheld versions or benchtop. Yeah.
Oh, sick.
Yeah. So we use that and determine that, even, and because it's X-rays pass right through a lot of materials, right? And the materials that are best at stopping X-rays are like heavy atoms, like heavy metals. right?
That's it.
So that means actually I could even take what we demonstrated is that I could even take a full cartridge, right? It's loaded with the oil still. I can aim that instrument right at the side of it and shoot right through it and tell if there's lead in there. And I have my answer in a few seconds without destroying anything.
That's it. Just a few seconds, huh?
Yeah.
Real quick.
Yeah. And all you would have to do, if you know, and the regulatory approach that we need to take from now on, right? I don't need to test every batch of oil that your cannabis company makes for lead, right? What I actually need to do is test the cartridges that you're using once. And then also you get your answer of whether those cartridges are safe to use before you've put your oil in them. So when you go in for your test for lead, you don't have thousands of cartridges on the line that you might have to destroy.
Boy, that sounds like a win-win-win there.
Yeah. So so that's one of the things we're trying to push right now, is trying to push for this a change, to regulate these as hardware. Kind of, if you could come up with a very useful list, right, of cartridges that have been tested and approved and those which are blacklisted.
Sure.
Right. And it seems to me that could be a pretty effective approach.
So how much does one of these little handheld zappers cost?
Well, I mean, it's not cheap, but new, they're on the order of 40,000, depending on the options. And you probably get them cheaper used. It's so, we're talking not something that you and I are going to run out to Target and just pick up, but for a regulatory
manufacturer or someone with a nice extraction lab, could probably afford that if they really wanted.
It's not very different from the expense of other common instruments that you might be using. And certainly, yeah, definitely, and I mean, it actually wouldn't be very difficult, right? It's not very difficult to share this kind of information, right? It's not necessarily the case that everyone would need to have one of these instruments testing their cartridges that they get, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So
you could just have the state could set up a lab and just keep one there, and
yeah,
run different batches from different. I feel like, boy, that would be. I got to tell you, boy, the percentages, what do you say? You confiscated some of these carts from high school kids or something, and 95% of them tested for lead or something.
Yeah. So that was So
Oof.
we kind of divide, So all right, so I kind of devised and demonstrated, right, this approach, and it's a new idea for cannabis world. As I told you, I didn't really invent anything. I was actually, this is something that's very commonly used.
No, you found a new application though for it.
Yeah. I just found a space where we needed it. But I wanted to think about what else can you learn from this, or what would be, how could you use this to figure out something a little more, to solve some bigger problem, right? And so it occurred to me at some point that, like I said, right, I would always find that the leaded cartridges were kind of the knockoff ones, right? And I actually knew from my previous experience with e-cigs, right, that these knockoff cartridges are really common in e-cig cartridges, if they're e-cig cartridges that you don't buy from a dispensary, right? Most, I don't have any statistics on it. But from my limited experience, I would say that any unlicensed distributor that sells cartridges is very likely that they're knockoffs. I really don't know the prevalence. So it occurred to me that there's a particular population of people who have really no access to the adult use market. And that population is children, right? Because, the one thing that always happens to me anytime I get near a dispensary is I start having to whip out my ID, right? I mean, gosh, man, at my favorite dispensary, I get ID'd 3 times.
Yeah.
Right? That is like, they are, the one thing they are certain of is they're not diverting any product to children, right? So it occurred to me that probably, high school students, right? I mean, if they have vapes, then it's almost certainly going to be knockoffs, right? Or at least it's almost certainly not going to be bought from a dispensary.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So so I collected confiscated vape cartridges. I think I got about 30. And then I took about 30 cartridges from the adult use market, and I just tested them each for lead and compared the results side by side. I did find a couple of carts from the adult use market that did contain lead. It was a little bit alarming. It was still a pretty low prevalence. I found that about 95% of those cartridges from high school students have a lot of lead in them. It's another example, right, of how this regulated market. I mean, it is somewhat successful as a public health measure, right? It is safer. But
It's definitely a step in the right direction in terms of that, for sure. Because boy, that was, I almost lost some sleep over this conversation we had on the phone. I was like, Jesus, dude, I've been smoking black market cards for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, from this, from the statistics that we have, we could calculate like an odds ratio, right? And so we could figure out that you're 500 times more likely to get a leaded e-cig from a high school student than you are from a Massachusetts dispensary.
Damn.
So,
wow.
yeah. So it's a big concern, right? It's a big concern for parents. Definitely,
sure.
Right.
I don't even like kids, and I was concerned.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like lead.
Well,
I feel like lead. So I feel like I've read that lead is worse when kids are exposed to it, or kids have more severe effects from lead poisoning.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the most insidious impacts of lead on people is to the brain. It's now been determined that basically any detectable level of lead at all in the blood has a negative impact on IQ. So if it's when children are exposed to it. So the person who first kind of spearheaded this research and actually drew a lot of attention to lead, because there was a very different attitude in the old days. Okay, people knew about lead poisoning, right? But lead poisoning is an acute condition from ingesting a bunch of lead, right? And it goes away. But this doctor named his name was Herb Needleman. All right, he saw some pediatric patients. He saw some children who did not have acute lead poisoning, but they seemed to have some cognitive effects from exposure to lead. And this was back in the 70s, man. I mean, they had lead in all the paint, right? It was in all the plumbing. Lead was in everything. It was in gasoline, right? Which means it was floating in the air in car exhaust. I mean, lead was everywhere. So there are a lot of people who believed it might not be so harmful. But this guy Needleman, I mean, he did experiment after experiment. He really showed, he really showed that, that looking directly at children, he showed that he could correlate their level of lead inversely with their IQ. So basically, the more lead in their body, the lower their IQ. And also, the more lead in their body, the more disciplinary problems they had at school. So it was very profound research that led to like the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1990 and the phasing out of leaded brass in all of our like plumbing.
I've seen some weird theories that say that it was a cause of a spike in violent crimes from all the behavioral problems.
I think that some of those ideas aren't so weird, actually. It's a little, I think it's the sort of thing, because it's such a complex phenomenon, it's hard to prove.
Sure.
But yeah, these cognitive effects that I'm talking about, right? Like poorer impulse control, which leads to disciplinary problems, reduced IQ, right? I mean, they're pretty strongly correlated with bad behavior of all kinds, right? So, so it's not unreasonable to suspect that this salting of our whole population, right, with lead, may have caused some problems.
Yeah, well, we're getting salted with a bunch of other shit now, so
yeah.
I wanted to ask you about a few other things. I believe you said that you did some tests and found that a lot of the cannabinoid levels were inaccurate that you were finding. I'd like to know about that. And then we're going to talk about lab shopping after that.
Yeah. So in the past year, I wanted to continue doing research. I wanted to continue doing like physical science research on cannabis, e-cigs, cannabinoids. I continue to believe this is a really important space. Like I can't emphasize enough, like one of the most urgent and important subjects that public health will deal with for the next couple of decades is cannabis, because the place of cannabis in our society is changing very fast. And that's going to have, just like every big change in society, there will be advantages and drawbacks. And it's going to, it will have impacts on people's health and on our collective health. And we simply don't have enough information or data right now to manage that transition very well. Right. And I think the evidence for that lack of data is the stuff we've been talking about, right? The fact that we're having to figure things out, the science is constantly having to catch up with the human behavior.
Well, right? It'd help if they let you guys get some grant funding.
I know, and right. Yeah. Everything needs to change. Yeah. There's just a lot that needs to change. To make us ready for the new place that cannabis is going to have in our society. And so I founded a research nonprofit called the Institute of Cannabis Science. And my goal is to do research that's important for public health, and in particular, research on real cannabis in the real world, and on the physical characteristics of it, the physical science of its consumption, and research that's for consumers. Because this is what I really see is lacking. I mean, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of research that's focused on children, right? And intervention and their development. There's a lot of research on addiction. There's a lot of research on potential harms. There's a lot of research on pain management or a few other pharmaceutical applications, but kind of in isolation. Right. And but there's a lot of research that isn't done. In particular in this environment, there's still no way to have any kind of very normal sources of research funding and then use those resources to test products from dispensaries, right? So that means that you're always going to be, like, in order to do science that way, right? I mean, you might be able to obtain from the NIDA drug supply program, right? You might be able to obtain some materials that are comparable to dispensary materials, but you'll actually never know. Because you'll never be able to test directly to tell how similar they really were, right? So, yeah. So, so I'm very convinced that we right now, like, we need a nonprofit like this. We need independent research organizations that don't have some of the restrictions that you have trying to do research at a university. Anyway, universities are kind of averse to risk, and
Sure.
research on cannabis that isn't about treating veterans with pain is just not politically attractive to be worth the risk for most universities right now.
And this might just be, I don't know, this from my observation, it seems like a lot of the studies that do manage to get funded are specifically looking for negative effects. It seems like
Yeah.
some of the folks who try to put forward studies where they not even want to say that they're looking for positive effects, but like even studies that are kind of neutral, it seems like, are having trouble getting funding. And it's always like, oh, cannabis leads to schizophrenia or psychosis and all this stuff. And boy, that seems it's just, and now you have this overwhelming volume of sort of reefer madness science, and to start to even balance that out a little bit is just feels like it's still going to take a long time.
Yeah, I think it probably will. I mean, I believe this is changing, and I have had some really, I've had some really encouraging conversations with some of the scientists at NIDA,
Huh.
right? Who NIDA is interested in NIDA is interested in making sure that cannabis research catches up to where we are now with it. But any kind of institutional change, it takes time, and and it's also like if I want to get a job as a new professor, right, and I say I want to do, I want your university to hire me, I'm going to do this research on cannabis, right? Those guys they're not experts at cannabis, right? So to them it still sounds, to them it sounds like high risk research. It sounds like I'm going to have trouble getting funding, right? It's going to be really uphill. But anyway, like I said, what I really care about is being able to test these products and tell consumers directly what I find out, right? Like, I'm trying to kind of, I'm interested in kind of like short circuiting some of this scientific process, right? Where I do the research directly at the ground level, and then communicate the results quickly directly to the people who care.
And I talked to another guy about this, Scott Waring, and we were talking about, the lab testing is one thing. Like, weed growers could spot a guy who maybe did something funky with his growing, or like certain people might be able to spot certain things. Not a lot of people could walk into a lab and like notice if you were cheating a test, or some people I've seen can't even read the COAs properly. And it's easier to keep the rest of the industry honest. It seems like there's not a lot of people who could call out a scientist and be like, oh, your machine's not calibrated properly, or your lab protocols aren't, you don't have your SOPs in order or whatever. And it seems like, I believe you said something about systemic fudging of numbers in several states that you've seen. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us how you could cheat some of these tests, or what people might do if they wanted to boost their numbers, or potentially like maybe make a pesticide not show up on a test or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's it's a little complicated because there's probably a bunch of different ways, right? And I think that the actually one of the first questions that I asked was, how, I mean, how consistent can this test be, right? So if what and this is discussing specifically testing the level of THC, or cannabinoid compounds in general, right? So and let's take the example of flower, right? Since that's the product that's like still most of the market. Um, so right, I think in Massachusetts, like about 55% of cannabis sales are flower. Um, so right, so if I want to test the levels of cannabinoids in flower, there's a very basic fundamental process that I do. Okay, I take some chunks of flour, right, and I extract them. I put some organic solvent in there and soak it in there until those cannabinoid compounds come out from the flour and mix with the solvent. And then I filter out all the insoluble stuff, and I use an instrument to test the concentrations
Like
of all the
HPLC.
compounds. Yeah. The commonly used instrument is an HPLC, right, which is a liquid chromatograph. Some people use other instruments, and sometimes they have little nerd fights about which way you're supposed to do it. And some of that stuff is probably really important, but it's also pretty granular. The there are a couple of there are a couple of key things to figure out here. I mean, the first one is how consistent should this be, right? These are each one of these is an individual flower from a plant, right? They are not identical. They don't look identical, and chemically they are not identical, right? And it turns out, right, if I take one flower after another from the same cannabis plant, or even like multiple chunks from the same flower, right, and I test them all, the answers that I get for all of them will be slightly different. All right, so that's what we call natural variability, right? It's a piece of produce. Yeah, it's a piece of produce, and it's individual, right?
And
They
what
all
would you
vary.
say? What would you say is like a fair range for this natural variability?
It seems like it's, I've heard different numbers from different people in the industry, usually not support, usually from their own anecdotal experience. What I have seen myself is that a typical variability is just a few percent. Okay, so definitely like you're or maybe like 10% of the value, right, if you say it that way, right? So a typical concentration of THC acid, right, the precursor to THC, a typical concentration is maybe like 18% by mass in the flower, right? Maybe 22, right? So somewhere in that ballpark right now. That's like kind of what the market really values, higher weight percent. But getting the plant to produce that much is kind of hard. So it seems to me right now the average in our marketplace is close to 20%.
Mm.
And so as I'm testing real flowers, what I'm getting are numbers like 20, 22, 19, right? That sort of variability. That's what I'm used to seeing. But the differences that I see between the values I measure and what's on the label are a lot bigger than 1 or 2 weight percent in many cases. They're as much as 10 weight percent. So I've tested some flower that was labeled at 31% THC, but I only found 22. That's a big difference.
Yeah, that's way out.
You really, I mean, that's a noticeable difference to a consumer also.
And it does seem like there's this push to like, oh, we gotta like the highest THC content is going to sell for the most money, which I think is kind of a marketing ploy in a lot of senses. And it does seem like maybe some of that is incentivizing labs to bump their numbers up.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's what I see, right? So I think I said that it's pretty complicated, and there's a bunch of different ways that things might happen.
Sure.
One thing could be that um, you know, a cultivator the rules are different in different states, but the selection of sample itself is pretty important, right? The cultivator has a whole batch, okay, which is usually like one grow room, right, going through like one flowering cycle. So and that's the level at which it's tested. So that batch is pounds and pounds of flour, right? And the amount of flour that they need to submit for testing is on the order of like tens of grams, right? They might submit like 30 grams, 40 grams here. So in Massachusetts, that cultivator is actually allowed to themselves select which buds they send in. And so they can cherry pick. And in fact, it's difficult for you to guarantee that the flour they sent is really from that batch at all. But even if it is, you know, they've made some attempt to select what they are pretty sure is their best flour, right? So it may not be representative. So that can be one challenge.
But also to your point, let me cut you off for a second.
Yeah,
they could have their whole weed cultivation facility set up. They could have their little home grow over here with something real nice, pick a nugget off of that, send that in for testing, and then fill their jars with the rest of the stuff in their facility. I mean, not to say someone would do that, but if nobody's there like watching them pick the sample and fill the jars, you could easily switch one out with whatever you wanted, probably.
Yeah. And so I think it's a pretty straightforward like law of human behavior that the easier it is to do that, the more frequently it will happen. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's a useful law, right? Because part of what that law also tells you is that you don't need to make it impossible. You just need to make it harder. Right? If you make it harder, then it will become less common, right? Maybe you won't totally eliminate it, but maybe you get it down to a level where you don't care so much anymore, right? Where it's unlikely.
Good point.
So, yeah, that's a big part of regulation because well-designed regulations often, they don't make the bad activity impossible. They just disincentivize it enough. So, anyways, yeah. So there's some challenges that could come from the way that the sample is submitted, right? But then there are actions that the lab could take because it's very common for a cultivator to contact a lab and say, hey, look, you got a test result for THC on this last batch that was lower than I expected. Could you retest it, please? I really don't think that's right. I don't believe you. And and if you keep on finding low numbers for me like this that are lower than I know, right? The cultivators, often super confident in what they've produced. So, they say, well, I'll go to another lab, right? And that's what's called lab shopping, is they can choose the lab to get the answer that they want for the test, maybe, right? They could possibly. Definitely, from speaking to enough people in the testing industry, I know that happens, right? I hear about it anecdotally.
I'm reading a lot about it.
Yeah. But, right, even if the experiments I did some off-the-shelf testing, right? I measure some big discrepancies in the level of THC in some flower products, right? That experiment on its own, it doesn't tell me why. So that's one important caveat that I have to give is like, I know that the consumer is often being ripped off, but that experiment at least doesn't tell me who did it.
Mm,
So
another good point there.
yeah. So, you know, the this the case, there have been a few pretty well documented cases of lab fraud. None of them in Massachusetts. But in one of those cases, the story was that the operator of the lab would go into their information system after hours and actually change a bunch of the sample masses. So that THC content, remember, is provided, the information is percent by weight, right? So it's basically, how many how many grams of THC in how many grams of flour, right? So there's a step of that calculation where I divide it by a number, and they make the answer bigger by dividing by a smaller number. So they just lower the sample mass. All right, that's like a really direct manipulation of data, right? I don't know how common that is, but it's documented to have happened a few times. There are other like sneakier things they could do. They could calibrate their instrument differently.
Is
Right?
that difficult to do if you're familiar with using the HPLC?
I think if you're familiar with how this is done, there are a few different ways. The simplest ways that I could imagine don't actually involve tampering with the instrument, but there's a critical step of the measurement where you compare to a certified reference material. All right, so it's a little vial of stuff that you buy from a lab company where they say this is exactly 1% THC in solvent. It's some precise concentration, and that's the critical thing that I'm pegging my determination on. So, if I take that certified reference material and I decompose some of the THC, then my instrument signal for that certified reference material will be smaller. But I'll say that smaller signal means 1% THC. So then all of my little peaks from your crappy flower are going to count for more THC than they should, because my comparison is wrong. So, that's another way. I think that, so there's a person named Jamie Toth who has, she posts a lot on Medium, and she's really interested in this subject. She's out of Oregon, and I think she's published a big long post that was 9 ways to cheat at third-party testing, something like that. You can check the title before me.
Hell yeah.
But yeah. So
Jamie Toth, the somewhat Cyclops.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So and
The
big
other
shout
one-
out to her too. She is wicked determined on this subject, and she's wicked smart, and she's persistent. She's worked really hard in Oregon to bring attention to this.
Okay. I just had one more that I wanted to ask about specifically, was like with something like a pesticide test. And I've seen, I don't know, I've heard like the EPA doing sketchy stuff like this where I don't know, you'll set the test so it's basically like not sensitive enough to detect the, whatever amount the state says is the limit or something like that.
Yeah. I've heard of things like that, and the pesticides. Boy, the regulation of pesticides well, there are a few key challenges there. So, one challenge is actually just the way that American laws are currently written about pesticide use in agricultural products. So, there's a law that says it's illegal to use a pesticide for any application that's not on the label. So that's a real challenge for a cannabis cultivator, because no pesticides have been approved for cannabis, right? Because it's not a legal crop. according to federal law, right? So there's one law that says it's illegal to use any pesticide, no matter what. And so when they write the regulations, they have these contortions that they have to go through so that the state regulation doesn't directly tell people to break the law using pesticides for an off-label application. So that makes it very hard for them to set good action limits. Then there's just, just like with everything, I mean, we know almost nothing. we know almost nothing about the prevalence of pesticides in cannabis flower or how it impacts your health or what it does, right? When we test pesticides for use in agriculture, we almost never burn them and see what happens when people breathe it in.
Right, like this Eagle 20 that combusts into cyanide.
Yeah. So, so there are a lot of challenges with regulating pesticides, but but some of the stories that I've heard for tests for any of these hazards, like pesticides or heavy metal contamination or for microbial contamination, I've heard similar stories and anecdotes about all of them, which is that at some unscrupulous labs, they might not even run the test at all.
Whoa.
Or
didn't think about that one.
Yeah, or they run the test in some way where they substitute just regular water for a critical reagent so that the test doesn't really work, so that it can never come up positive.
Wow.
And
so you're making like false negatives, basically.
Yeah. And so we can imagine, I don't know how often it happens, right? I could only speculate of whether that's really happening or how often. But it seems like it's pretty possible. And there's a really good incentive for it because, if you're a cultivator and your weed that you thought was 25 only tests at 20, that's like a little kick in the balls, man. And it's like a few bucks maybe. Okay. But it's not likely to be a showstopper unless your THC level is really below some threshold where people really don't want to buy it anymore. Which happens definitely. Sure. Right. But if your weed tests positive for a pesticide that's banned or for a heavy metal, then you've got to destroy the whole batch. And that is fucking expensive, man. So, so there, I would say that determining how often something like that happens is a big study. I would have to buy lots of samples.
Right. You'd have to go to dispensaries and just buy random samples.
Yeah. And to prove because, it's, if stuff like that is happening, it's probably not happening to half of all the weed, right? It's probably a lot less. And so because it's less prevalent, I have to buy a lot more to catch it. So that's why I did a study about potency. Even though potency is not the biggest public health concern, it matters to people. It's important. But, potency was the easy thing to prove because it's half of all the samples.
Gotcha.
Right? But for some problem like pesticides or heavy metals where you only expect that maybe a small minority of the samples will be contaminated, then I have to buy hundreds of samples in order to catch it.
And that probably gets expensive, huh?
Super expensive.
Running the tests and also buying all the weed.
Yeah. And really, for me, the expense has been, so I've usually been lucky that the tests get done for me often, usually for free, by concerned citizens who are running testing labs, right? So the people who are running honest labs, right, they don't want to compete against dishonest labs, so they're willing to help with research.
Sick. I'm trying to get my buddy to start a testing lab in Southern Vermont.
Yeah.
I'm going to put you guys in touch. I think I told you about him.
That sounds good. I love meeting new people from the testing space. Anyone in cannabis industry, really.
He's not in there, but he's been in biotech for a long time, and he's just been running labs and building labs, and he's a good shit. Look, I got one more question for you here before we get out of here. And it was something you said on the internet. I believe you said that you think all synthetic cannabinoids should be banned. I'd like to hear your
Oh,
thoughts on that one.
yeah, yeah, or at least should be. I mean, we have to really change the way we approach them. So, um, the the big concern I have with these like hemp derived cannabinoids, like Delta 8, right? Um, those are they are not they are not produced at the quality of chemical manufacturing that you need for something that a human consumes. And they're not tested, they or they're rarely tested, right? I mean, perhaps some certificate of analysis might be provided with a product, but that's even easier to fake than sending in like bud from a different batch, right?
Yeah, that's
I mean,
just a little Photoshop job.
yeah, his distillate really all looks the same, right? So certainly those are the easiest to spoof. And I experienced for myself, right? I told you that for about a year of my research, I was using Delta 8 THC a lot, and I did a lot of really close analysis on it. And every time I bought it, it was different, and it was always full of other shit.
Yeah.
It was not pure compound, so that's really my concern. I mean,
What kind of other shit were you finding in it?
the scariest part is it's unknown.
Oh,
Like, I literally did not know what else was there sometimes, right? I would just know that it's only about, even so usually I would purchase it and it arrives to me and it's cloudy, it's some funny color, right? So then I'd usually distill it myself to like purify it more, but I find even after purification, it's still only like 85 or 90% Delta 8 THC. Maybe 1 or 2% is other cannabinoid compounds. And then the rest of it, I don't know.
mystery liquid?
Yeah, mystery liquid. I would have required more analysis to figure out. Yeah. So, I think that's very common for these alt cannabinoids, these kind of hemp derived cannabinoids. They're not they're it's a very unregulated space. Nobody is checking to make sure that those manufacturing, our pharmaceuticals all go through this like certified good manufacturing practices protocol. All right, it's a set of regulations that establishes whether a chemical manufacturer is following the best manufacturing practices, right? And so it's a certification that any production facility needs to have before they can start producing pharmaceutical drugs, right? Well, the labs produce, the companies producing these alt cannabinoids, they're not usually getting that. All right. And I would call up the supplier and ask him, how come the batch is yellow and cloudy this time? And the guy would just tell me, it comes out different every time, man.
That's the fun of the game.
Guys, dude's not a chemist, right? And and he's not testing it to make sure it's safe. And in fact, some of those compounds, they've never been tested on humans at all. So even if it is the pure compound, you still don't know what it's going to do to you, right? But if it's the impure compound, then it's a lot more risky. So yeah, so I think maybe my words might not have been best chosen, because I think that it's not that I believe that that no form of those products should exist, all right, or that no one should be able to have Delta 8, right? I mean, any one of those compounds could be some other, may have some therapeutic value for some people, right? Has different risk profile than, traditional like Delta 9 THC or cannabis, right? So they in potential, they could be useful, right? And you could potentially make them with certified good manufacturing practices and testing every batch and selling them to people. And I wouldn't have a problem with that. Really, though, I have a big problem with the way it's happening.
Yeah, and it definitely, that seems like the kind of thing you want a fucking chemist for.
Yeah,
I
and
I would be more comfortable with that.
yeah, and it's and and also, it really, those things really remind me. I mean, that is exactly what happened with vitamin E acetate. Like, what the purpose of vitamin E acetate? Vitamin E acetate has this perfect viscosity for a vape cartridge. All right, I really learned how they work. I figured out that if the material in the vape cartridge is too viscous, it doesn't flow into the heating cell and the thing doesn't work. And if it's not viscous enough, then it's too runny and it just leaks out.
Ah,
So you need just the right viscosity, and vitamin E acetate has it. And so you can use vitamin E acetate to dilute your THC so that your vape is only 40% instead of 80%, which actually some people want, right? And and everyone thought, well, hey, look, it's in all the vitamin E acetate is a very common
the
ingredient in
vitamin.
skin cream. Yeah. And yeah, you can eat it. You can eat it. It's harmless, right? You can rub it all over your skin. It's fine, right? So they assumed it would just be fine for this too, right? Nobody thought like, oh, I'm going to poison a bunch of people. Like, of course not, right? Like, but
Hopefully.
they added it because they thought it would be a good thinning agent that has the right viscosity and works well. And it does. It just works great in a vape cartridge. But the problem is it makes people sick when you do it that way. And so that's the kind of experimentation that you need for any of these other alt cannabinoid compounds before you just start selling them to people.
Sure.
So sooner or later, it is not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. There'll be some other like outbreak of vaping illnesses, and it'll be related to one of these, one of these like back alley cannabinoid vapes.
Well, I remember all the spice and the K2 shit, and
Yeah.
people were freaking out off of that.
Yeah, and those compounds also, those are cannabimimetics. So the chemical structures are actually totally different from the phytocannabinoids, but they also react with human cannabinoid receptors, right? And some people had very bad health outcomes from those too.
Some people looked like they were on bath salts or something, just really freaking out, man.
Yeah. So as we see people continuing to modify the structure of the cannabinoid compounds chemically and get more elaborate, they might hit upon other compounds that are as harmful as some of those cannabimimetics. That's another risk.
Yeah, it does seem like they're finding a new cannabinoid like every day. It's like the THC, A, O, B, X, Y, Z. Like it seems like they got the whole alphabet covered, and it's just like it's hard to keep up with this shit.
Yeah, and they will keep. There's a lot more room. There's a lot more room for modification, so there will be plenty more. We'll see them keep coming out at about this rate for probably at least a decade.
Damn.
Yeah.
Damn, Jeff. Well, I'm going to leave it right here. Jeff Rawson, President, Institute of Cannabis Science, Cambridge, Mass. I want to thank you for your time, dude. This has been fascinating. You nailed it.
Thanks for letting me go on, man.
Dude, honestly, I got to get out of here, or I'd probably get another hour out of you. But we could definitely, I hope we can do this again sometime, because this was absolutely fascinating. And you nailed all the questions that I was curious about. And I always leave the last word for my guests. So if you got anything we missed, or shameless plugs or shout outs you want to throw in, now is the time, man. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, right on, man. Well, I don't know. I guess, in light of the conversations we had, I guess I'd say, vapes are fun for some people. Alt cannabinoids might be interesting, but dude, maybe just consider just rolling a fucking joint. All right. And the other thing I'll say, I believe we're doing really important work. I hope you agree. Check us out at cansci.org. That's where that's the website where I am very gradually putting information up. And yeah, keep your eye out, and please give us your support.
Word up.
Yeah, right on. Thanks so much, Caleb.
Good luck with everything, Jeff. I wish you the best, man.
Yeah, right on. This was so much fun. Thanks for talking.
Peace.